I hope that that seeing the pictures of the promised land here will help warm things up in your heart, realizing that we have quite a history when it comes to the subject of altars. And so that's where we're going to be tonight. God's land continues to tell God's story. And altars built by the hands of man are no exception. If you go there today to the land called the Promised Land or Israel, you will find still altars erected in various places, some to pagan gods, some to the God of Israel. What were the altars? Well, you'll see the map tonight. We're in Zone 3, but we're going to be pretty much the whole length of what we call the Patriarchal Highway, the ridge route running north to south. You see, above the Jezreel Valley, the mountains run east to west. But below the Jezreel Valley, they run north to south. And so this ridge route is where the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, traveled back and forth over the centuries. And it was on this route where Abraham, the father of our faith, traveled and met with God. It was here where he built altars. Noah built altars. Abraham built altars. Moses built altars. And we saw Joshua building an altar on Mount Ebal. I got a lot of help on the whole subject of altars from Jack Beck, our resident scholar. He doesn't live here, but he's promised to come back, so we're calling him resident. But from his research, I discovered that altars are referenced in the Bible over 400 times. So when you find something that is in 66 books 400 times, you ought to pay attention. And I don't know about you, but this word mizbah in the Hebrew altar is not something I've really given a lot of thought to. I kind of think I know what they're talking about when they say they built an altar. And I grew up in a church, a little tiny church in Burbank, California, and we had an altar at the front. And I would go up there and kneel sometimes. And so I kind of had an idea, but it was never a rock place. And we never sacrificed anybody on that altar. So I was always a little confused as to how we made that transition. But altars in the Bible were meant for worship. They were meant for memorials. They were meant for making covenant with God and God with us. And they were also meant for sacrifice. Don't think that an altar was always used for sacrifice. Specifically tonight, though, we want to look at Abraham's altars, and he built 4. I'm sure he built more, but these 4 are the ones he mentioned. You'll see the map: Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, and Moriah. Now, there are other altars in Israel. This is Shechem. We were here just a few weeks ago with Joshua and the people of Israel at the renewing of the covenant when they came into the Promised Land. But here, it was Abraham who first built an altar. We don't hear of the mount called Moriah that much. We hear of Calvary. We hear of the Temple Mount. But Calvary, or Golgotha, where they have built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is essentially built on what has always been historically known as Mount Moriah. We'll unpack that in just a little bit. And down at the end of your map, you'll see the altar at Hebron. Also, the city called Tel Beersheba, it's Hebron. And it's here where Abraham plants a tree and builds an altar. Now, let me say something a little bit about the tamarisk tree. The tamarisk tree is a very valuable tree in Israel. If you're out in the wild and you find a tamarisk tree, It is wise to put your tent in its shade. Why? Because a tamarisk tree can grow where other plants cannot grow, because it sends down a deep taproot to find water. So where you find a tamarisk tree, you know there's water. So when it says Abraham planted a tree, it meant he set up camp. Somehow he knew that this was a place where that tamarisk tree would grow, and he built an altar. This is not the original altar. In fact, this is a replica of the altar that was uncovered, and that altar would not have been the altar that Abraham built. It was probably built near or on the same spot that Abraham built his, but this one is of cut stone with the 4 horns of the altar. The original one that they uncovered is in the museum in Jerusalem. This is a reproduction that you can touch while you're there. But Abraham's altar would have been of uncut stone, but would have had 4 horns. It is a mystery. Some scholars believe they know the reason, but most scholars agree that there's not a sure reason as to why there were horns on the altar. There's all kinds of study you can do on that if you'd like to research it. Most believe that it was probably there were different size grates, and all of you men out there who barbecue can understand this. Based on the size of grate, it would get you further away from the fire for the sacrifice. And remember, sacrifices were cooked and eaten. So, we have that picture. Now, we also have the picture up in northern Israel, the area of Dan, up above the Galilee, where, if you remember, a few weeks ago we were talking about King Jeroboam, who took the 10 northern tribes. He built 2 different altars, one in Bethel and one here in Dan, to keep the people from going back to Jerusalem to worship there. The one here in Dan, you can see the footprint of the original one. The model, the scale model built on top of it is to give us an idea of how big that altar was. So you can envision that. But again, a 4-horned altar. Now, if you go down into the Megiddo Valley, the Jezreel Valley, you'll come to the city of Megiddo, and uncovered here is an ancient Canaanite altar, believed to be one of the oldest in the land, uncovered some 20, 30 years ago. Now, Hatzor, we're going back up north now. This is a land a city that Joshua conquered, and the Israelites took over. You remember Joshua gave very clear instructions. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Put away your idols. 100 years after the Israelites took possession of Hatzor, it was destroyed again. And this was found there, an Asherah pole. I don't need to explain this to you, I hope. But this was a form of pagan worship that the Israelites living there had begun to go back to, pagan worship. And this is the only known Asherah pole in all of Israel today. So it was quite a find. And so we have this area, this 4-horned altar, this place where the children of Israel would at times build altars, but Abraham specifically built these 4 altars. Now, I've talked before about our authority here at Crossroads, that we have authority over us. I have a district conference superintendent, Max Edwards. He and his wife, Judy. I don't know, is Judy here tonight, Max? Okay. They attend church here when they're not traveling. I think, Max, I can't remember how many days, weeks a year you spend traveling. About 30 weeks a year. Traveling to various churches, encouraging the pastors and preaching and teaching. And about 6 months ago, we started talking about this very subject, and Max lit up. And I said, whoa, easy, Max, easy. And he said, oh, let me talk to you about these altars. And so the closer we got to this, I said to him, Max, would you just take some time in the middle of this teaching on altars and give us your perspective on Abraham's altars at Shechem, at Bethel, at Moriah, and Hebron. And so he's agreed to do that. So Max, why don't you come on up, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to sit over here. And do you need me to move any of my stuff?
Nope.
Okay, good. All right.
Good deal. Thanks. Good evening. I'm going to read just quick the verses of Scripture that mention the building of the altars, and it's in Genesis chapter 12. And so if you have a Bible, it's great. I don't think we're going to put them on the screen. We're going to just stay on that map. But Genesis chapter 12 is kind of where Abraham's story begins. God speaks to him and opens up himself to Abraham and calls him to leave his homeland, leave his pagan roots, and come into relationship with him. And Abraham does. And so I'm just going to lift out the verses, and they're really quick, but they're the ones that mention the altars. So in chapter 12, verse 6, it says this. Abram, his name was changed to Abraham by God later. You know that, of course. Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh. At that time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abraham built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. Then Abraham continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev. And that's what we see, of course, in that he was following that ridge route south. And the rest of chapter 12 tells a story of where Abraham goes on down into Egypt, actually, because of a famine, I think, because of circumstances. And he lies to Pharaoh about his wife, the relationship that he had with her, said that she was his sister. And then verse 4 of chapter 13, he comes back to the altar at Bethel and Ai, and it says this was the same place where Abram built the altar, and there he worshiped the Lord again. And we're going to unpack that in a little bit. But he comes back to this altar between Bethel and Ai. And then at the very last verse of chapter 13, you see the third altar, Hebron. So Abram moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. There he built another altar to the Lord. And then over in chapter 22. So a lot of time passes between the building of these three at Shechem and Bethel and Ai and Hebron. And then chapter 22, a powerful chapter in Abram's life. He builds a chapter on Moriah. And it says that God told him to come to this place, and he followed the Lord's direction. And verse 9 says, when they arrived at the place where God had told him, Abram built an altar, arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So I want to just sort of unpack that a little bit. Now, Abraham has a story, and we all have a story, and I think in many ways we find ourselves. That's what this whole sermon series that Pastors Jeremy and Jim have been talking about. You've been seeing that God tells his story right in the land. He puts his fingerprints, so to speak, in the place names and in the events that happen there. And we all have a story, and we find ourselves in this. And God folds himself into our story, and he calls us into a new story, all sorts of amazing things. My own story started in, started in 1959 when I was born, but I mean, in 1980, I had made a wreck of my life. In 1976, my mother was killed in an automobile accident. I was 15. My life was spinning out of control. I wandered into drug and alcohol abuse, all sorts of crazy happenings on the University of Iowa campus. And the Lord redeemed that somehow amazingly and spoke to me and called me to himself. And in the spring of 1980, right around Easter time, I knelt at an altar, in one sense, in my brother's rocking chair lap at his living room. He was my pastor at the time, my brother. And I gave my heart to the Lord on a Thursday afternoon. And that was, in a sense, my first altar. And then you could just go on and on from there. But we all have a story. And Abraham has a story, and he tells the story, I think, in part through the window of these altars. And we know, of course, Moses wrote the account in the Pentateuch, and a lot of it was actually revealed to him by divine revelation. He wasn't there when when Adam and Eve, of course, were placed in the Garden of Eden. God revealed those things to him. But I think at some point, whether it's Tower of Babel or whether it's Noah or whether it's certainly Abraham, Moses wrote these things down as a result of the oral tradition that had been passed on to him. It was only just a few generations back. And can you imagine sitting at the campfire and hearing Isaac tell his daddy's story? Or hearing Abraham tell his own story in the picture of these 4 altars? He probably built, as Pastor said, a lot of altars, but these 4 powerfully tell his story. Well, why is that? Well, I think it's because he comes from this Haran, this pagan lifestyle out Ur of the Chaldees. His family moved up to Haran, and then God called him out of there. He crosses the Fertile Crescent and begins to come down into this land, and he arrives at Shechem, and in chapter 12, God appears to him and says, I want to give you this land. Not a whole lot of strings attached, not a great big fanfare. Basically just shows up and says, Abraham, I want to give you something. I want to bless you. I want you to be in a safe place. I want to make a place for you. Now, Shechem, the word means place of burden. When I think about this ridge route and the journey that Abraham was on, it reminds me, frankly, of Pilgrim's Progress. A guy who's on a journey. John Bunyan writes this story of a guy who's on a journey, and he knows something. God is speaking to him. He doesn't know quite what to do. But he's just kind of stumbling along the path, in one sense, trying to find the right path, and he's burdened. He has this huge burden. Literally, Shechem means this place right here, because that's where they would bear the burden. That's where you would carry the pole that the buckets hung from, or carry the pack on your back. The place means burden. And Abraham was burdened. He was burdened by a pagan lifestyle. I was burdened by all of the sin that I had piled up against God. And God called Abram out of that and said, I want to know you.
Yeah.
And Shechem is the first place. So God reveals himself, and he builds an altar there and says, yes, I receive your blessing. And he starts a journey. But then, right away, he comes down and builds this second altar that's maybe more fascinating even than that to me. I think it's particularly fascinating that it's between 2 places. I mean, every place has a name, right? Why say it's between 2 places? I mean, even Shechem. We know Shechem's between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Why didn't he say it was between Ebal and Gerizim, Jim? I don't know.
We'll ask Jeremy.
Jeremy would know. But this second altar specifically says it was built between 2 places, with Bethel on the west, Bethel, which means house of God, and Ai on the east, which means trash heap. I think Abram's telling his story. And he's saying this: God met me, he showed himself to me, and I built an altar at Shechem because I rolled my burden away. And I rolled it on him. But then I came to this place, and I could see the house of God over there, and I could see the trash heap there. And now, these next 2 altars are kind of connected in time. God shows up through his life. He's 75 years old when he builds the altar at Shechem. But then we see him again at 86, and we see him at 87, and we see him at 99, and we see him at 100. And all of that time, he's at these next 2 altars, basically. He actually camped and spent a lot of time down in Hebron. But this altar, Bethel and Ai and Hebron, I think in some ways are connected. They're the middle part of his life. The first part of his life, the first window, is where the burden rolls away. The last window we're going to get to on Moriah is a powerful one. But this middle part of his life, so he builds this altar between Bethel and Ai. And he spends years there. He lies to Pharaoh, and he lies to Abimelech, and he takes Hagar, and he has a child by her instead of trusting God to bring a child through Sarah. I mean, all sorts of stuff happened through his life there. And stuff happens through ours too.
Yeah.
Lots of wandering around and going backwards and forwards, 2 steps forwards, 3 steps back sometimes. This relationship with God is not pure and clean all the time, is it? And so he's building between these 2 places, and I think it's very much like this. It's like Abram telling his story. He said, I would come back to this altar again. We saw it in chapter 13, verse 4. He came back to this altar again and again because he can see the house of God, so to speak. I mean, in the place names. He could see the house of God over there. He says, I'm not there yet. I'm not where I want to be. but I can see the trash heap over there, and I'm not where I was.
Amen.
And man, I can think about that in my own life. And I think in some ways I'm still wandering around between Bethel and Ai. You know, I don't know about you, but I can see where I want to be, and I'm not quite there yet. But I can see where I was, and I know I'm not there.
Amen.
God's cleaned me up and is doing a work in me. So then he comes down, he builds this third altar at Hebron, and he spends lots of time here. We see him by the oaks of Mamre over and over again. The angels appear to him before they go into Sodom. He has this journey where he goes out and rescues Lot, who's been captured by pagan kings. All sorts of things happen near this place. This Hebron means, the word means association. It means like agreement, like father and son, like Sanford and Son, you know? I have a Mossberg shotgun. Mossberg and Sons is actually a company. A guy came from Europe and established a bicycle shop, but eventually his sons joined with him, and they formed an arms company called Mossberg and Sons. And it's kind of like that. And so I think what Abram is telling us through his story and what these altars tell us is, yes, we begin at the place of burden and God just calls to us. And he speaks, no strings attached. I want you. Come into my land. I'm going to give you this land. But then between Bethel and Ai and then in Hebron, God is developing him. He's growing in his relationship. But Abram has made a decision, and that decision is, I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm in. I'm all in. I'm committed. I'm going to be in covenant with you. And yes, I may be wandering around between Bethel and Ai a little bit, but I am all in. I'm committed. It's kind of the perfect love that Wesley talked about, a heart that has been made new. Not a perfect performance, but a perfect heart. I'll divert just a second if I have time and tell you a story that I heard from a professor at Asbury one time. I didn't go there, but I mean a continuing education event, and he said a little girl sees her father sweating, cutting the lawn, and so she's been making mud pies, and she makes him a glass of lemonade, and she takes it over to him, and she gets her fingers in it, and he can see the mud sort of trickling down through the lemonade. And she's, this little girl, was her performance perfect?
No.
No. Was her heart perfect?
Yeah.
Yes. She wanted to bless her daddy. It's kind of like that. I mess up all the time, but I really do have a heart that's in covenant with my Father. So that's kind of what Hebron paints the picture of. Now, we get to Moriah. Moriah is where God said, I want you to take your son. Because, we don't have time. I don't have time today to unpack the whole story, but you know Abraham's story. He says you're going to have a son. And he had kind of promised him that a long time before when he's 86. And then they do the whole thing with Hagar and stuff and trying to take, matters into their own hands. But then God appears to him at 99 years old and says, I want you to circumcise yourself. Wow. And God says, you're going to have a son not through Hagar, but through Sarah. Sarah's in the tent. She laughs. You know what the word laughter is in Hebrew, right? Yitzhak. Isaac. She laughs. Isaac. She laughs and says, I'm 90 years old. He's 100. We can't have children anyway, but God's doing this marvelous thing, and they do. They have a son. She has a son at 90 years old, and God has blessed them, and now joy has come into their life. And then we don't know exactly, something 10, 11, 12, 13 years later, God says, I want you to take him and go to a place I'll show you, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. Now, the place that God calls him to is Moriah. And this place is the same place where Jesus sacrifices himself for us. The son climbs up on the altar and dies. God is foreshadowing that in Abram's life. Now, like I said, there's a lot to say here, but does God believe in child sacrifice? No, not at all. Matter of fact, we see in Jeremiah when he is condemning the pagan nations for their child sacrifice, he said, it never enters my mind. It never entered my mind. It's in my notes somewhere. You can write it down, but it's in Jeremiah 32, 35, if you want to check it out. God said, it never entered my mind that you would sacrifice your son. But he actually tells Abram to do this. Why? He's testing him. And Abram knows it's a test. Abram knows that God's not going to ask him to leave his dead son on the altar. He even says to his servants that have the packs and the donkeys and the supplies, he says, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you again. God, he knew, even Hebrews says, he knew God would raise him from the dead if it came to that. He knew that God was just testing him. And it's very much a foreshadowing of Israel's command to give the firstborn to God. Not in killing them, but in covenanting to say, God, you're first in my life. Because family was everything back then. Even is now in some ways. I mean, family's first in our heart, but God says, I want to be first in your heart. So anyway, God was testing Abram. He passes the test. He puts his son Isaac on the altar. Now, the Moriah, we got to finish, but Moriah means to see God. You could take the word and do some different things with it, and scholars do, but it literally comes from two Hebrew root words that mean to see and God. And we sang earlier, Stephanie led us and the worship team led us, and we sang the song that said, Lord, I want to see you. God, I want to see you. Yeah. Really?
Right.
Are you sure? Because to see God means to put him first. You're not going to see him if you don't put him first. And that's what Abram does. He puts him first. He puts Isaac on the altar. God says, wait, don't sacrifice him. I just needed to know where your heart was. He finds a ram in the thicket. He sacrifices to God. And in one sense, that's what it is to see God. It's what it is to worship, is to put him first. You can worship on Wednesday morning at Walmart. You can worship on Saturday night in church, and it doesn't have to be, this dichotomy of you only worship in church. Worship is to see God, and to see God is to put him first. So I have one thing to say. This is Abram's journey, but it's our journey. I don't know where you find yourself in this story. I don't know whether you find yourself burdened but called by God. I don't know whether you find yourself kind of between Bethel and Ai at Hebron. Are you between Bethel and Ai but not at Hebron yet? Kind of in the trash heap. Not there yet. Not there. Anyway. But you can be at Hebron. You can be at a place where you covenant with God. Now, Moriah, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that I'm not at Moriah yet. It's the last hill to climb. It's a place where God says, I want all of you. Everything that's important to you. So I don't know where you find yourself in this story, but I do know this. You've heard, most of you that are here, you've been here, you've heard something before called transformation theology. This is exactly what we find in Abram's story, because the very first time when God speaks to him, he doesn't really attach strings. He just says, I want to give you something. I want to give you a land. I want to bless you.
Right.
That's refuge. But then, do you know what he says in chapter 17? In the middle part of Abram's story? He says, walk before me blameless. Wow. That's transformation. God wants to transform. Yes, he calls Abram in with no strings attached, but now he wants to transform him into something different. And then, because he passes the test on Moriah, God says, because you've obeyed me, the whole world will be blessed because of you. And God's basically in partnership with him. And so it's refuge, it's transformation, it's partnership. Where you are in the story, I don't know. I kind of know where I am. I know where I am. But you maybe need to sort of think, where am I? And think about the altar and what it means. So,
great.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Pastor.
Max. That's a powerful, it's not just metaphor, it's a symbol of where we are, and that's great. And as the church went on, the word used thusia in the Greek, in the New Testament, that word altar appears 24 times. It's not in the same degree the Old Testament as it was in the Old Testament, but the New Testament talks about it, and in different ways, though, and yet enhancing what we already have learned from Abraham. Hebrews talks about the altar being the place where only those who believe in Christ can meet. Isaiah and Revelation both prophesy that heaven has a huge altar in front of the throne. It's not an altar of sacrifice. It's an altar of praise. You know, in the modern church in the past 2,000 years, altars look different. Here I am at Wesley's Chapel in Oxford, England. The altar looks totally different than the four-horned altars. But how many of you have ever either been to this or seen this happen, an altar call at Billy Graham Crusade? Anybody ever gone forward at an altar call at Billy Graham Crusade? All right. What does all that mean? You know, when you go into the catacombs of Rome, where so many Christians were buried, you get into these specific areas and you'll find these arched coverings over the gravestones. It's depicted over here in this middle piece of art on the wall. The artwork is depicting a specific grave found in in Rome, in the catacombs. But whenever you see an arch over the slab, it was usually meaning this was the grave of a martyr. And Dory and I had the opportunity to be there with a group of pastors from around the world in the Roman catacombs. And in some of the rooms where you would find these, they were quite large. And the reason they were large is so that the Christians could sneak down in there and worship in those places. And so it was an amazing experience for us to sing a song down there, a hymn of praise. They just echoed through the chambers. And I mean miles of chambers down there. But you see, on top of the stones of the graves of the martyrs, they would serve communion, the bread, the wine. And they did that for a reason, to remind the church that the church is built on the blood of the martyrs. So altars are unique throughout history. And today we still have the practice in some churches of kneeling. In evangelicalism, some come from more of a Reformed background, and the communion table was more of not a sacrament as much as it was a symbol of remembrance. Altar calls were not used, and they're not familiar, and so sometimes you get into a church where they do them and you're not sure exactly what to do. Then there are other churches, Lutheran and Methodist in background, who find their roots in Anglicanism, and altars were used as a place of sacrament, where the communion was more than just something to remember, but the actual taking of the bread and the cup could actually be a means of grace. In other words, if I'm not a believer, but by faith I'm coming to partake of that bread and that cup, I can, in that moment, partake of Christ and receive salvation. But the idea of coming down and kneeling didn't really start happening until the late 1700s, early 1800s. Whitfield, Edwards, Wesley, they didn't have altar calls. But we know that by the time Peter Cartwright, the Methodist circuit rider, came along, he was giving altar calls. Charles Finney had what he called the anxious bench. When you're hearing the preaching of the Word, you hear the message that Max shared, and something in your heart is making you anxious. In other words, I'm too uncomfortable to leave this place without settling matters with God. And they begin to use the altars as a place to just come and pray. Billy Graham, of course, kind of made them famous in this century. Coming forward has happened in certain segments of Protestantism. I got to be honest, altars have been places where God's met with me. At the age of 17, it was an altar in a church in Pasadena, California, where I knelt and straightened things out with God. It was shortly thereafter, sitting in the service, that God called me to ministry. After leaving the ministry, thinking I never wanted to be a pastor again, spending 3 years in the business world, I went to visit to a pastor's conference because a bunch of my old friends were there. I just went to see them, not to go to the pastor's conference. I wasn't a pastor anymore. I don't remember who was preaching. I don't remember the sermon. I remember an altar call, and I had to go. And I went down there, and I knelt. And in that moment, it was just as clear as me looking at you tonight. The Lord said, "You're ready." And I got up. I came home, and I told Dory, I don't know what this means, but we're going back in. I should have said, "Cover me." And it was shortly thereafter Crossroads was planted. Altars have been significant in my life. What does this mean? The word worship literally means to bow down in humble adoration. It doesn't really matter whether we kneel at an altar or we build an altar. What it matters is whether we kneel before Christ. Worship is humility. And that's what God calls us to. Biblically or historically, the purpose of the altar is to alter the worshiper. Biblically or historically, the purpose of the altar is to alter the worshiper. I think about Shechem. If I've got a burden that only Jesus can take, I have the invitation to roll that burden onto Christ and receive salvation. I really like what you talked to us about, Max, about Bethel and I. It's a great illustration. I'm not where I want to be, but I know I'm not where I was. I don't know about you, but I want to say amen to that. How about Hebron? He planted a tree. In other words, I'm going to live here. I'm setting up camp. I intend to get under the shade of this little stick coming up out of the ground. Lord, you know I'm not perfect, but you can't shake me. You can't shake me because I've been walking with you long enough to know that there's no other way to walk. I'm with you. We're a father and son team, a father and daughter team, whatever you want to put in there. Lord, I'm setting up camp. I'm putting a stake in the ground. That stake's a tamarask tree. One of these days, I'm going to get under the shade of it. It's going to send its roots down. I'm going to dig a well. I'm going to find water, living water. This is where I'm going to live. Or Moriah, where Christ sacrificed himself for us, where he calls us to sacrifice ourselves for him. Now think about Romans chapter 12. Paul's talking to the church at Rome. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable." This is the only true way to worship, to give yourself to God. So, I love history. I think you've probably figured that out. I love telling the stories of the Bible. But there's a real danger when we come to a Bible study or to a church just to be intellectually stimulated. Knowledge is important. It can change us. But the purpose of knowledge is to transform our hearts. And when I come to a message like this, and the words you shared tonight, I'm reminded that the purpose of an altar is to alter the worshiper. The question is this: are you willing to build an altar before God? To roll the burden off? To plant a stake in the ground? To climb the hill? I've been asking myself that this week. Max and I prayed that tonight before the service.